Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Badly Designed Abilities. I said I was going to make another one because I felt like there were still a few more I wanted to go over, and for episode 5, the archetype I'll be going over will focus on counter-type abilities, which is a hotly debated category throughout the League community for its tendency to drastically influence matchups and outcomes of a fight. I talked about this earlier in the year when I made the counter abilities video, which some of you may be wondering what's different about this one. This episode will mostly highlight what I think are well-designed counter abilities and badly designed ones, as I didn't get much of a chance to go through each one in more detail. I was mostly talking about the holistic design of counter abilities in that video. Incidentally, if you want to watch it after this one, I highly suggest you do so, and while we're on that, be sure to check out my other badly designed abilities episodes if you haven't yet. By the way, spoiler alert, if you're wondering why I didn't go over Yasuo's Windwall or Gwen's Hollow Mist, it's because I already went over it in previous episodes. Before getting started, I want to ask everyone, if you're in the market to cash in your Christmas bonus or presents on a new phone, then why not try the new Red Magic 9 Pro, the newest release of the Red Magic phone line. Red Magic is a professional gaming equipment brand that's all about pushing top-notch gaming devices, from monitors to keyboards, mice, and of course, phones. The Red Magic 9 Pro is a mobile device optimized for gaming with the latest cutting-edge parts, including but not limited to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 processor, up to 16 gigs of DDR5 RAM, half a terabyte of UFS 4.0 storage, one of the best battery capacities I've seen, a screen with 120 refresh rate, and an instant touch sample rate of 2000 Hz for perfect controls. It is pretty much everything you can ask for in next-gen phones. There are honestly too many features to go over from hardware to software, but the basic gist is that this phone is very robust in performance. Being made specifically for gaming, they have a plethora of gaming related stuff for you to enjoy. First and foremost being the game space. By flipping the switch on the side of your phone, it puts the phone into a gaming mode and pulls up a library of all your games, including a list of settings for you to play with. They even include a library of plugins for you to take advantage of, ranging from crosshairs to AI triggers, double tap assist, and whatnot, many of which are extremely helpful for games like Wild Rift, PUBG, Fortnite Mobile, Minecraft, Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail, and such. Tons of customizable features for things like smoothness, performance over power efficiency, or vice versa, and so many more things. I should also mention that Red Magic uses Android OS, so all of you Galaxy or Pixel users, Red Magic will feel very intuitive to you. If you're interested in copying a new gaming phone for yourself, then definitely check out Red Magic using my link on screen or in the description. I'm honestly impressed at how much they put into this thing while keeping it sleek and flat at the same time. Thanks again to Red Magic for sponsoring my channel, but for now, back to the video. So, with this episode focusing on a very specific type of ability, I want to start by giving you an example of a well-designed counter ability. I believe that it's good for champions to have natural advantages over others instead of making every champion a blanket statement, do everything and handle everyone. That might sound uncharacteristic of a top main, seeing as how top lane is governed by whoever gets to counterpick, but it does add to the personality of the game that makes it better off in the long run than if it wasn't present. Arguably my favorite counter ability when it comes to actual well-designed ones is Dr. Mundo's Go Where He Pleases.
Mundo goes where he pleases!
It has a very interesting premise that greatly shifts the flow of a matchup without permanently hamstringing the opponent and locking them out of ways to play to their win condition. Basically, Mundo gets to ignore one hard crowd control effect while this is off cooldown, kinda like a persistent spell shield but only for crowd control. What happens then is that he loses a small chunk of current health and a canister drops on the ground, not unlike how Poppy's Buckler does. If he picks it back up, he recovers max health, which is a net positive most of the time, and reduces the cooldown of the passive by 15 seconds. Enemies, however, can step on the canister to break it. The beauty of Mundo's passive is that it leads to a minigame. At level 16 onwards, if Mundo picks up the can, he fully refreshes his passive, letting him continuously ignore crowd control for as long as he can pick up the can. But if at any point the opponent destroys it, he's vulnerable to crowd control for that time. In the late game, he can be a massive f*** you to one-button crowd controllers like Morgana, Blitzcrank, etc., but there are two reasons why this ability is well designed. First, it only nullifies the hard crowd control aspect. It doesn't stop you from getting slowed, nor does it negate the damage. Enemies can still look to use their crowd control abilities just to hurt Mundo, especially considering he loses 4% current health to activate it. It doesn't completely diminish the effects of your opponent. Moreover, a bad Mundo player might tunnel vision to retrieve the can, causing them to take more damage than it's worth. Second, prior to level 16, it's an extremely long cooldown if you don't pick up the canister. So hypothetically, a Darius or Urgot can still use their E's to pop his passive, then step on the can, giving them about a minute to do whatever they want. It's a circumstantially valuable passive that still affords agency to the opponent if they know how to play around it. It doesn't break matchups, contrary to popular belief. So, with this in mind, my criteria for what separates a badly designed counter ability from a good one comes down to 3 factors. What's the impact and how much does it have? What must be given up to have this brief moment of power? And finally, what can the opponent do to play around it? The third one is the important part. For me, the strength of a mechanic doesn't matter, it's whether there are countermeasures in place to handle it. You can have an ability that's an instant one-shot to any champion, but if it takes 10 seconds to channel, then no one would complain about it. Although that in and of itself does pose an issue with design. In any case, let's talk about 5 badly designed counter abilities. First off is Jax's Counter-Strike. I've talked about this a million times by now, what's one more?
Can't touch me.
Though nowhere near as degenerate as it used to be way back when dodge chance was a thing, it's still one of the most polarizing abilities in the game. For up to 2 seconds, Jax negates all non-turret basic attacks and their effects, while taking 25% reduced damage from all area of effect abilities from champions. Upon recast after 2 seconds, he deals magic damage to all enemies nearby, increased by 20% for each attack he nullifies up to a 100% increase, and stunning them for 1 second. Prior to his mid-scope at the beginning of Season 13, it used to deal a flat amount of physical damage and scale off bonus AD, but since then it was changed to magic damage and it now does percent max health damage as well. Personally, I was never a fan of Jax being a hybrid damage dealer considering he's a duelist, which already is the hardest class of champions in the game to fight head-on. But even before the change, Counter-Strike was always an issue. Evidently, it's supposed to counter basic attacks. That's a very blanket type of move if we're being honest. Every champion to some degree auto-attacks, meaning Jax's Counter-Strike is never not useful. Furthermore, he takes 25% reduced damage from AoE abilities, so Counter-Strike can still be used to withstand incoming fire whether it's a basic attack or not, albeit to a lesser degree. This is one of the highest impact counter abilities of all time. How about the second factor? What must be given up to use this? Absolutely nothing. There's no cost to trade off to using Counter-Strike. Jax is free to move about, cast his other abilities, and attack you with impunity. Were just that alone, maybe it would be tolerable. But then, it comes with an AoE stun that deals fairly significant damage, so not only are champions who rely on auto attacks unable to do anything for 2 seconds, but then they're unable to do anything for another second after, for 3 seconds of being completely useless against a champion who can curb stomp you in a fraction of the time. You can make a defense of simply kiting him during this time or baiting him to use it early, but that doesn't qualify as counterplay since counterplay requires interaction. Running away for a few seconds does not count as interaction. If you're an auto attacker, there's no counterplay versus Counter-Strike. Contrary to its description, this ability is less of a stance and more of a buff, since Jax doesn't even root himself in place. Worse yet, kiting him isn't even possible given that it comes with a built-in stun, so if you don't have a dash or some way to quickly put space between you and him, you get stunned. This makes it good for chasing, for running away, for almost every situation. In a vacuum, Counter-Strike is objectively unfair. It's fair, somewhat, on Jax due to him lacking a neutral game, forcing him to commit to fighting to make use of it, but it's disproportionately strong for how valuable it is. Completely nullifies basic attacks, reduces AoE damage, AoE stun upon recast, deals percent health damage, gets stronger if you try to attack him during this time. What's the trade-off? Nothing. There's no trade-off to using this. Ideally, you want to use this whenever it's off cooldown because even if your target doesn't use basic attacks, you still get a stun and big damage. This is why Jax is hated by so many players. Counter-Strike just does too much. Speaking of counter abilities that completely shut down an archetype of champions with no skill required, let's talk about Nasus and his patented Wither.
Become dust.
Raise your hand if you like this ability. Anyone? No one? Good, because I don't either. Wither is another one of those abilities that's so ridiculously overpowered but kept balanced by the fact that it's on one of the worst champions in the game. While I don't think it's as big of a middle finger as Counter-Strike, the one virtue to Counter-Strike is that it's indiscriminate. Wither, on the other hand, feels personal every time he uses it. On opponent quick activation, with the target range of 700 making it so not even Jinx, Tristana, or Caitlyn can stay far enough away, he applies a 5-second slow and cripple to his target, which increases every second over the duration, beginning at a 35% slow that ramps up all the way to 95% at rank 5, and a max cripple of 71.25%. The rule of thumb is that the heavier the slow is, the shorter it lasts and vice versa. Any slow with a duration of more than 2 seconds normally caps out at 40%, since any higher would be really oppressive. Wither caps out at 95% and lasts for 5 seconds, the longest slow in the game if I remember correctly, and that's not the worst part. The worst part is that it slashes your attack speed by almost 3/4, so a champion with 2.5 attack speed gets knocked down to like 0.7, which is inconceivable. One cast of Wither can cancel out the attack speed of 3 items, maybe even 4. And to repeat, it has a target range of 700. The only champions that can stay far enough away while still attacking would be artillery mages or Senna. That's about it, and even then, he likely carries Ghost, so you're screwed either way. This is one of the most crippling debuffs in the game, no pun intended. With enough ability haste, it also lasts forever too, since he can reapply it as soon as it wears off. This makes Nasus one of the hardest champions to duel since you either can't move, or your DPS is gone, or both. In terms of impact, Wither makes fighting 1v1 impossible unless you master E who can ignore cripples. In terms of cost, once again, there is no cost. He presses a button and you just have to pick a god and pray. What's the counterplay? There is no counterplay, not unless you intentionally go out of your way to build around it by taking Phase Rush, Cleanse, and QSS. Over the years, they buffed Wither so many times that it went from being somewhat threatening to an insta-lose in a 1v1 situation, and just like Counter-Strike, even if your target uses abilities instead of auto attacks, the 5-second 95% slow prevents you from going anywhere. The only way to beat Nasus is to 3v1 him and kill him before he kills you. Cutting him 1v1 is just unfeasible, I don't care who you are. Third ability will be Cassiopeia's Miasma. Unlike the first two, this one's a bit less egregious, but there's a reason I put this on overpowered abilities. On activation, she covers a large area in Poison Clouds that damages and heavily slows enemies caught within, while grounding them so long as they remain trapped in it. Grounding's a very divisive mechanic. Anyone grounded can't use movement type abilities, including stuff like Flash, Hextech Protobelt, etc. It's effectively the same as Root, only you can still walk around. Doesn't sound too bad, right? You can still attack, still use abilities and other summoner spells, still use item actives, basically everything except dashes and blinks. Why is this such a bad thing? The bad thing is how effective it is even against enemies that are not part of its intended countergroup. The point of Miasma is to stop hypermobile champions from doing their thing, forcing them to have to walk out of it to continue doing said thing. This is far easier said than done since, when cast at max range, Miasma is wide enough to cover the entire width of a lane. And it has near instant activation. Adding insult to injury is that while trapped in the Poison Clouds, you're heavily slowed by up to 80% at rank 5. To be fair, since Miasma is the last ability Cassio maxes out, is closer to 40% than 80, but that's still a very heavy slow. It'll take most champions a fairly long time to get from one side of Miasma to the other. During this time, she's constantly pelting you with Empowered Twin Fangs for massive damage. The alternative is to stand and fight, but that requires you to look at her, which is anything but a good idea in light of Petrifying Gaze. Stunning her for 2 seconds if your character's facing direction is towards her at the time of contact. So despite being an ability geared towards impeding dash champions, it's actually effective against everyone, sometimes more so against immobile champions whose only real method of escaping pressure is flesh. At the very least, a fighter like Irelia can use Defiant Dance to stall for time. Jinx, on the other hand, is just dead. The unfortunate part is that Miasma used to have a built-in countermeasure, a minimum cast range, making it so if her opponent was already at melee range of her, she couldn't use this to shut them down immediately. Miasma basically has no weakness now. It's good for melee champions, ranged champions, dashers, or non-dashers. The only champions that she loses to are long-range fighters like Xerath, Syndra, etc. Comparatively, Sinja's Mega Adhesive or Poppy's Steadfast Presence are healthier forms of grounding. The former is only 1 circle as opposed to Cassio's 8, and it doesn't even do damage. The latter has no slow component, a measurably shorter duration, and it only stops dashes, not blinks. I understand that with Miasma, Cassiopeia is one of the most vulnerable champions in the game, but this ability is just too game-changing in certain cases. Cassiopeia is a hard counter to Kassadin despite Kassadin being an anti-mage champion. I kind of liked Miasma back then when it was just an expanding cloud of poison. In fact, I would have no problem with current Miasma if it just didn't have that grounding or slowing effect. Pick one, lose the other. Have it so that it either only grounds or heavily slows, not both. Next one is Fiora's Riposte.
One step ahead!
In some ways, Riposte is fair and balanced. In others, it's even worse than the prior 3. For 3/4 of a second, Fiora renders herself completely immune to all hostile effects not originating from structures, preventing her from taking damage, being crowd controlled, or even affected by status effects during this time. At the end of the duration, she strikes forward, dealing magic damage to all enemies in the line of fire until it collides with the champion. The enemy champion struck is slowed and crippled by 50% for 2 seconds. If Fiora is struck by at least one hard crowd control ability during that 0.75 second time, the slow and cripple instead become a stun. Okay, so let's give it some credit first. Unlike Jax's Counter-Strike where he can move about and do whatever the hell he wants, Fiora has to root herself in place for the span of this attack. Moreover, the forward strike is a narrow skill shot, forcing you to aim, whereas Nasus is point and click, while Jax and Cassio are fairly generous AoEs. Also, compared to Wither's egregious 5-second duration, 95% slow, and 70% cripple, Riposte is only 2 seconds and 50% of each, and given that she almost never builds ability power, this thing doesn't do much damage. Then what's the problem? The problem is that it's attached to an actual good champion. Wither is busted, but Nasus usually spends 2 or 3 of the 5 seconds getting in range of his opponent. Fiora has tons of movement speed and a low cooldown dash. She can rush you down very fast. This makes the slow and cripple on Riposte arguably more deadly in the right conditions. Not to mention, it's a full 2-second stun if she manages to parry any crowd control. Why this matters is because most crowd control abilities require the caster to be stationary or go through some kind of animation. For example, if Silas wants to use Abduct on you, he's going straight towards you, guaranteeing that he gets stunned by Riposte if he doesn't flash out immediately. Same goes for, say, Yone. If Yone third Qs onto you, he's stuck in animation, making it really easy for Fiora to stun him. Some champions can work around this like Aatrox and ironically Jax, who can move out of the way mid-animation, but not everyone has that luxury. Additionally, it's kind of insane how Fiora is immune to all hostile effects, including debuffs. If you try to use Ignite or Exhaust on her during this time, she completely bypasses it. At the very least with someone like Pantheon, he's still affected by all debuffs even in the direction he's invincible towards, but Fiora is untouchable whether she is or isn't facing you. I wouldn't argue Riposte is as bad as the previous 3 given that it doesn't procure immediate guaranteed value and has elements that can be played around, but there's a reason Fiora is kind of a brainless counter to a lot of champions. The payoff Riposte grants is insane. Personally, I don't understand why it also cripples. I feel like if it were just a slow, it would be infinitely more acceptable, but even if you don't parry crowd control, that 50% slow and cripple is just as bad to get hit by. Okay, so I know I have yet to go over Neela's Jubilant Veil, but I think you get where this is going by now, and the video is getting kind of long. For the sake of thoroughness though, Neela's Jubilant Veil has much of the same properties as Jax's Counter-Strike, where at the press of a button you effectively shut down half the roster with no consequence. And instead of an AoE stun, she has the potential to give it to her entire team. Not only that, but she and by extension all of them gain bonus movement speed and still take 25% less damage from magic attacks, making it an all-purpose defensive ability. To her credit, Jubilant's Veil's cooldown is more than double that of Counter-Strike, but I mean, considering it can affect her entire team, this is an infinitely better version of Shen's Spirit Refuge in every conceivable way. Overall, I feel like counter abilities become an issue when they artificially inflate a champion's threat level to an insurmountable extent, even if only for a short while, and that's what these 5 abilities do. They elevate their respective users' pressure by so much that the only safe method of recourse is to be as far away from them as humanly possible and then fight them when said abilities are down, which doesn't make for very fun interactions with the opponent. Counter abilities should do their job of countering certain things, but it should not overcorrect if that makes sense. Stuff like Mundo's passive, Ramsey, Nocturne Spell Shield, those are healthier examples of counter abilities. Anyways, that's gonna be it for today. Let me know your thoughts on this video in the comments down below, whether you agree or disagree with my stance on it. Aside from that, if you enjoyed the video, I encourage you to leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and be sure to check out the other episodes of my Badly Designed Abilities series if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.